I always believed that raising my children with love, patience, and strong values would be enough, but nothing prepares you for the day when your own children look at you and see nothing but a barrier to their greed. At 62, I wasn't expecting to fight for control over my own life, especially not against Michael, Stephanie, and Daniel, the very people I sacrificed everything for. It started with whispers behind closed doors. Conversations that stopped the moment I walked into the room. Then came the concerned suggestions that I should get a health checkup just to be safe. I wasn't naive. When you've spent years navigating financial markets, you recognize when a deal is being made, even if that deal is about you. What my children didn't know was I was 10 steps ahead, and when they tried to declare me incompetent, they uncovered a truth they never saw coming. If you think betrayal only comes from strangers, think again. Stay with me because this is the story of how I reminded my children exactly who they were dealing with. I wasn't born into wealth. Everything my late husband Richard and I built came from decades of discipline, smart investments, and sacrifices no one ever saw. When Richard passed away 10 years ago, people assumed I'd step into a lavish lifestyle, buy a mansion, travel the world, spoil myself. But that was never me. I stayed in our family home in San Francisco, a modest place by today's standards, but it held memories, and I didn't need more than that. My 3 children, however, saw things differently. Michael, my eldest, at 42, always believed he was destined for greatness without ever putting in the work. After his 3rd failed business venture, he came to me expecting another check as if I were his personal bank. Stephanie, 38, was no better. Her world revolved around designer labels, luxury vacations, and keeping up appearances. She called it networking. I called it draining. Then there was Daniel. At 35, he was the youngest and the most impressionable. Daniel never truly found his path, and unfortunately, he often followed his siblings' lead, even when it led him straight into trouble. I tried to guide them. I tried to teach them the value of earning, of patience, of living within your means. But to them, I was just being frugal, old-fashioned, controlling. The tipping point came when Michael stormed into my study one afternoon, waving his latest business plan like it was a golden ticket. He needed a small investment, $500,000. When I calmly said no, explaining that I wouldn't fund another reckless idea, his face darkened. "You're hoarding money. You don't even know how to use any more," he snapped. Stephanie chimed in days later, accusing me of wasting away the family fortune by letting it sit idle. I could feel their resentment growing, not because I'd wronged them, but because I refused to enable them. Soon after, I noticed the subtle shifts, the hushed phone calls between the 3 of them, the awkward silences when I entered a room, the fake smiles laced with calculation. Then came the suggestion, no insistence, that I visit a doctor. "Just a routine checkup, Mom," Stephanie had said too sweetly. Daniel nodded along, avoiding my eyes. That's when I knew this wasn't concern. It was strategy. They weren't worried about my health. They were positioning themselves for something much bigger. But what they failed to remember is I wasn't some helpless widow clinging to old memories. Before I became their mother, I was Victoria Harrington, the strategist, who could read between every line and anticipate every move. And I was about to remind them exactly who they were playing with. The following weeks felt like living in a house filled with strangers. My children thought they were being subtle, but every glance, every whisper confirmed what I already suspected. One morning, as I was having tea in the garden, Maria, my housekeeper of 20 years, approached me. She hesitated, her eyes filled with worry. "Mrs. Harrington, I overheard something last night," she said quietly. Maria had always been more than staff. She was family. So when she told me that Michael, Stephanie, and Daniel had been meeting with an attorney, an elder law specialist, my heart sank. They weren't just talking behind my back. They were actively plotting to have me declared incompetent. I sat there holding my cup, feeling a mixture of emotions I can't quite describe. Anger, sadness, but above all, clarity. Maria went on to explain that they'd been discussing how to present evidence that I was no longer capable of managing my affairs. They planned to use my refusal to fund Michael's business and my unusual spending habits as proof. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Choosing not to waste money was now being framed as mental decline. But this wasn't a joke. They were serious, and Michael was already positioning himself as the ideal candidate to take control of my finances. That night, I walked through my home looking at the family photos lining the walls, birthdays, holidays, graduations. I wondered where I'd gone wrong. How did the values Richard and I worked so hard to instill get twisted into entitlement? But there was no time for self-pity. If my children wanted to turn this into a game of power, they needed to remember who taught them how to think strategically in the first place. The next morning, I called Jonathan Blake, my attorney and trusted advisor for over a decade. He was the only person who knew the full extent of my financial restructuring after Richard passed. When I explained what was happening, Jonathan didn't sound surprised. "Victoria, you always planned for the worst. Now it's just time to execute." With his guidance, we began documenting everything. Maria and a few loyal staff members provided detailed accounts of conversations they'd overheard. We installed discrete audio recorders in common areas, not because I wanted to spy, but because I needed undeniable proof. Within days, I had recordings of Michael discussing how they'd convince a judge that I was no longer fit to manage my estate. Stephanie suggested bringing in a doctor. They could nudge in the right direction. Daniel, well, he mostly sat in silence, but his agreement was clear. The betrayal was deeper than I imagined. But instead of letting it break me, it sharpened my resolve. Jonathan and I reviewed the trust documents I had set up years ago. The bulk of the family fortune, $18 million, was safely locked in an irrevocable trust. I had designed it with clauses that anticipated exactly this kind of scenario. Any attempt to undermine my competence would trigger an automatic disinheritance clause. My children thought they were about to seize control. In reality, they were walking straight into a legal trap of their own making. But I wasn't done. I wanted them to see the full weight of their actions, not just lose access to money, but understand the cost of their greed. So when Michael suggested a family dinner to discuss their concerns, I agreed calmly, as if I had no idea what was coming. Little did they know I'd be bringing a guest to that dinner, and by the end of the night they would realize that the woman they underestimated was still the one holding every card. The evening of the so-called family dinner arrived faster than I expected. I watched as Michael, Stephanie, and Daniel sat around the dining table, each wearing a mask of concern so carefully crafted, it would have fooled anyone who didn't know better, but I knew better. Jonathan Blake sat quietly beside me, his briefcase resting against his chair. My children exchanged uneasy glances when they saw him. Michael cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Mom," he began, his voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy, "we've noticed certain things lately. You've been forgetful, making unusual decisions." Stephanie leaned in, her tone saccharine. "We're just worried about you. We thought it would be best to have a professional evaluate, to ensure you're okay." Daniel avoided my gaze altogether, staring down at his folded hands like a guilty schoolboy. I let them speak. I wanted to hear every word of their performance. When Michael finally got to the point suggesting that I voluntarily allow him to oversee my financial affairs for my own good, I smiled. A calm, deliberate smile. I reached for my glass of water, took a sip, and then nodded to Jonathan. He opened his briefcase and carefully laid out several documents on the table. Beside them, he placed a small digital recorder. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice steady. "But before we continue, I think it's only fair that I share something with you." I pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Michael's voice, confident, arrogant, discussing how they'd manipulate a doctor's report. Then Stephanie's suggestion about finding a cooperative physician. Even Daniel's reluctant agreement echoed through the dining room. The color drained from their faces. Stephanie was the first to react, her voice rising in panic. "Where did you get that? You've been spying on us." Michael's jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward Jonathan, calculating his next move. Daniel just sat there frozen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "For months you've been conspiring to strip me of my rights," I said calmly, framing your greed as concern. Jonathan slid the trust documents across the table. "These," he explained, "outline the structure of the Harrington Family Trust, something your mother established years ago." Michael glanced at the papers, confusion flickering across his face. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't," I replied, "because none of you ever bothered to ask how this family's wealth is actually managed." I leaned forward, meeting each of their eyes. "The $18 million you're so eager to control is protected. I control the terms." And buried within those terms is a Clause 1 that disinherits any beneficiary who attempts to challenge my competence. Silent Stephanie's lips trembled, her bravado crumbling. Michael looked like he wanted to argue, but what could he say? The evidence was irrefutable. "This isn't just about money," I continued. "It's about trust, about family, and you've shattered both." There was no going back from this moment. Whatever illusions remained of a loving, united family had been stripped away, replaced by the harsh light of truth. I stood up, smoothing out my dress. "You thought I was weak. You thought I was old, vulnerable. But you forgot who raised you, who built this foundation you're so desperate to plunder." I paused at the doorway, turning back one last time. "From this point forward, understand this: every dollar you receive will come with conditions. And if you ever attempt something like this again, you won't receive a cent." I left them sitting there, speechless, exposed, and forced to confront the reality they had created. That dinner wasn't just a confrontation. It was the point of no return. After that dinner, the house was quieter than it had ever been. Michael, Stephanie, and Daniel left without saying much, too stunned to argue, too proud to apologize. But I knew silence didn't mean understanding. It meant they were regrouping, trying to figure out if there was still a way to salvage their plans. I wasn't about to give them that chance. The next morning, I met Jonathan at his office. We both knew that exposing their scheme wasn't enough. If I wanted real change, if I wanted to protect what Richard and I had built, there needed to be structure and consequences. "Victoria," Jonathan said, sliding a set of new documents toward me, "this is what we discussed. The amendments and conditions for future distributions." I reviewed every word carefully. The plan wasn't to punish them out of spite. It was to force them to confront the entitlement that had poisoned their judgment. First, I established mandatory financial literacy programs. If they wanted access to their trust allocations, they would need to complete certified courses, understanding investments, budgeting, and responsible wealth management. Second, I introduced a philanthropy requirement. For every dollar they received, a percentage had to be matched in charitable contributions or community service. They needed to learn that wealth wasn't just a privilege, it was a responsibility. Finally, I reinforced the disinheritance clause, making it crystal clear. Any future attempt to undermine my authority, challenge the trust terms, or manipulate legal guardianship would result in immediate and permanent removal from all benefits. Once everything was finalized, Jonathan sent formal notices to each of my children. No room for negotiation, no loopholes. A week later, Michael called. His tone was different this time, measured, cautious. "Mom." "I got the letter," he began. There was a pause, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "I didn't realize how much you had in place." I could hear the frustration beneath his forced politeness, but also a hint of respect. "I did what I had to do." "Michael," I replied, "this isn't about control. It's about ensuring that you, Stephanie, and Daniel grow into the kind of people who deserve the legacy your father and I built." He didn't argue. For once, he listened. Over the next few days, Stephanie reached out too, less combative than I expected. She asked questions about the financial courses, trying to mask her curiosity with sarcasm, but I could tell she was beginning to grasp the reality. Daniel sent a simple message. "I'm sorry, Mom, it wasn't much." But it was a start. I knew change wouldn't happen overnight. Years of entitlement don't dissolve in a single conversation or legal document. But I had set the foundation by taking control, not just of the money, but of the lessons attached to it. I was giving my children something far more valuable than a blank check. I was giving them the chance to redefine who they were. For too long, I thought being a good mother meant saying yes, funding dreams without question, protecting them from hardship, but real love, real responsibility meant knowing when to say no, when to hold them accountable. I didn't enjoy laying down the law, but I knew that if I didn't, they'd never learn. And deep down, I hoped that one day they'd look back and understand that this wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the most important lesson I could ever teach them. The plan was in motion. Now it was up to them whether they'd rise to meet it or fall victim to the very greed that almost tore us apart. 3 months. That's how long it took before I saw the first signs that my children were beginning to understand. At first, I expected resistance, angry phone calls, legal threats, or at least passive-aggressive messages, but none of that came. Instead, they went quiet. Not the scheming kind of quiet I had witnessed before, but a reflective silence. Then one afternoon, Jonathan called me Victoria. "You might want to hear this," he said. Amusement in his voice. Michael had enrolled in a financial management course, not just signed up, but actively participating, asking questions, even meeting with mentors. I'll admit I was skeptical. Was this just a performance to unlock his trust funds? But a week later, Stephanie followed suit. She registered for a nonprofit leadership program combining her philanthropy requirement with something that actually aligned with her social interests. And Daniel. He surprised me the most. Daniel reached out directly, not through Jonathan, not through a lawyer. He asked if we could meet for coffee. When I saw him sitting alone at that cafe, he looked different, less guarded, more grounded. "Mom," he began, "I know I don't have the best track record. I let Michael and Stephanie influence me. I was scared to speak up. I listened quietly as he explained how the past few months had forced him to reflect, not just on the money, but on the kind of man he wanted to be. I started volunteering," he continued. "Not because I had to, but because I realized I've never actually done anything meaningful on my own." For the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the boy I used to know, the one with a good heart, before entitlement clouded his judgment. That conversation with Daniel was the turning point. A few weeks later, we arranged a family meeting, this time initiated by them. No lawyers, no hidden agendas. When we sat down in the living room, the energy was nothing like that fateful dinner months ago. Michael spoke first. He admitted they had been wrong, not just in what they tried to do, but in how they viewed me. "And the fortune, I thought money was freedom," he confessed. "But now I see it's a responsibility I wasn't ready for." Stephanie nodded, adding, "You were right to put limits on us. I didn't realize how reckless I'd become until I had to actually earn something beyond just spending. It wasn't an apology wrapped in excuses. It was genuine." I took a deep breath, feeling a weight I didn't know I was carrying begin to lift. "I never wanted to control your lives. I told them I wanted to prepare you for a world that doesn't care about last names or inheritance. Your father and I worked too hard to let this legacy become a curse." There were no tears, no dramatic embraces, just honest conversation. The fallout from their betrayal didn't vanish overnight. Trust once broken takes time to rebuild. But for the first time in years, I felt hope. They had been forced to confront themselves, to face the consequences of their entitlement, and in doing so, they discovered something far more valuable than what any trust fund could offer. Character. As weeks turned into months, I watched subtle changes take root. Michael started consulting for small businesses, using what he learned to help others avoid the mistakes he once made. Stephanie launched a charitable foundation focused on community arts programs, something she was truly passionate about. Daniel continued his volunteer work and even began studying social work. I didn't praise them immediately. I wanted these changes to be for them, not for my approval, but quietly in my heart, I felt proud. The climax of this story wasn't in the confrontation. It was in the growth that followed. They thought they could take control by declaring me incompetent. In the end, they learned that true power comes from competence of character, not control over wealth. Looking back now, I realize that the greatest challenge I ever faced wasn't building wealth. It was teaching my children how to live without being consumed by it. When Richard and I started our journey, we dreamed of giving our family security a foundation that would last generations. But somewhere along the way, that security blurred into expectation. And expectation turned into entitlement. I used to blame myself, wondering if saying yes too often had softened them, if protecting them from hardship had robbed them of resilience. But the truth is, every parent wants to shield their children from struggle. What we forget is that struggle shapes character far more than comfort ever could. That's why when they tried to take control of my life, I didn't just fight back to protect my rights. I fought to protect them from becoming the worst version of themselves. It wasn't easy. Drawing that line, risking what little relationship we had left, terrified me, but sometimes love means standing firm even when it breaks your heart. Today, my children aren't perfect, neither am I, but we've rebuilt something stronger than blind loyalty or financial dependence. We've built respect. They've learned that wealth isn't measured by what's in a bank account, but by integrity, responsibility, and the impact you leave behind. And I've learned that being a parent doesn't end when your children grow up, it evolves. If you're listening to my story wondering how to handle betrayal from those you love most, remember this: standing your ground isn't cruelty, it's courage. And sometimes the hardest lessons we teach are the ones that save the people we care about.